Hi everyone and welcome. It is another Thursday night live from Worcester, and we're going to have our March free education event. We have some exciting speakers. We have a very exciting offer that's being brought to us. But as is our tradition, can I have everyone be upstanding, and will Al please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Amen. All right. One of the things that we often have as contests is that we come to the end of the equation, the end of an election, and we say, well, geez, we didn't do as well as we thought we did. Why are there all these young kids who seem to think socialism is a good idea? I mean, come on, it only killed 200 million people in the world last century. Well, part of the reason for that is what our guests are going to talk to us. Part of the reason for this is what Andrew Breitbart told us. Culture is upstream from politics. So, without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Strang. He is here, professor of philosophy, and he is going to help us get an insight into this. So, without further ado.
I'm going to start actually by some quotations from some of these sources you probably are acquainted with in many cases. And what I'm focusing on primarily is political correctness, which of course collaterally is connected with the problems we have in education today, among others. The first quote is from Natan Sharansky, a prominent Jewish defender of the state of Israel and also of the interests of free societies. And he says this, in part, says, we are experiencing problems directly related to the phenomenon of a minority who does not believe in the values of democracy, confronting a majority who have given up on demanding those values. Sharansky was especially talking about the situation in Europe. This was in advance of the recent bombings we've experienced in Belgium. He says we are inhabiting a society, or I should say a context in which there is a distinction between free societies and fear societies. The geography of fear societies is growing larger and larger, said Sharansky, who actually spent time in Soviet prison camps himself. And he notes that he's often been asked whether there's a future for Jews in Europe. You're probably aware of the great anti-Semitism that has been sweeping across Europe the past 10 years, and it's heightened in more recent years. And he says, my answer to them is to ask whether there is a future for Europe in Europe. Because Europe, as we indeed see confirmed by the events just the past few days, is indeed a fear society, divided up into several subsets, as it were. Another quote I'm going to move on to is by Daniel Greenfield. You're probably acquainted with him if you read Free Republic blog. He's frequently cited there. And he speaks about political correctness. He makes these comments. He said, political correctness is not just about banning certain jokes. That's only the smallest part of it. Political correctness is about making the political filter, the left's lens, mandatory for everyone. And with respect to events on campuses, he says, campus wars are dividing universities between academic departments and activist departments. The activist demands call for embedding activism deeper into the structure of universities, with more activist deans, departments, and professors dedicated to their agenda. Funding is diverted from education to activism. the activist curriculum become mandatory to recruit more student activists. And student activists demand exemptions from their studies in order to conduct activism. Academics will take a back seat to such activism. And this is borne out by another quote from Victor Davis Hanson, a prominent classical scholar, who says this. He says, students now leave campus largely prepped by their professors to embrace a predictable menu. The glories of larger government, income redistribution, greater entitlements, radical environmentalism, abortion, multiculturalism, suspicion of traditional religion, and antipathy to the international role of the United States in the past and present. Unfortunately, this costly indoctrination comes at the expense of what is increasingly less taught: traditional mastery of foreign languages, great works of literature, philosophy, history, mastery of grammar and composition, and the Socratic method. Now that's all true, and I can affirm that myself. Now I've been out of active teaching since 2009. Things were not quite as bad then, but there were already many problems we could find on academic on the campuses. I taught primarily at state schools in New Hampshire, University of New Hampshire system, and it was evident then already, not the degree of activism we see now, with the creation of these panic rooms and safe spaces and so on to protect students, so-called students, from hearing anything or being disturbed by anything that might conflict with their politically correct attitudes. But clearly, I experienced many cases in which departments were being subverted. Certain requirements that were ordinary in acquiring a liberal arts degree were being eliminated progressively, and instead you had, in their place, you had the creation of new departments. You probably are aware of these: Black Studies, Gender Studies, Environmental Studies, Environmental Justice, Social Justice, and with all the collateral faculty and sub-faculty and assistants that these new creations require. So the way was being paved already. Things are much worse now. Just one other quote here. This is by Scott Powell, who writes for Canada Express. I think it is Free Canada Express, I believe, or Canada Free Press. And he says this in part: it's time to connect the dots on the growing intolerance on the political left in America. Recently, Forbes magazine reported that at more than 400 of America's largest and most prestigious colleges and universities, 62% of them maintain policies that restrict a substantial amount of speech protected under the First Amendment. Speech comes in many forms, but typically what is banned in students is student speech that, quote, feels offensive or, quote, demeaning toward groups or causes that are deemed politically correct. On many campuses, students who question secular progressive orthodoxies, whether extreme environmentalism, climate change, socialist economics, multiculturalism, or accommodation of illegal aliens or Islamists, fear grave penalties, harassment, and outright silencing. In effect, speech codes chill freedom of expression and the competition of ideas. Worse, it turns out that speech codes driven by political correctness foster coddled, weak-minded, and intolerant graduates, ill-equipped for employment and citizenship in the marketplace diversity of viewpoints that is the real world. Intolerance and political correctness that has subliminally debilitated public discourse and debate has been working its way into government at an accelerated pace since Obama took office. To fundamentally transform America, Obama's stated goal at the time he took office, his administration undertook a concerted effort to institutionalize political correctness in the regulation of key areas of the economy. I would add many other areas. Healthcare and banking were restructured following the passage of Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, while the energy sector, which is nearly 80% fossil fuel reliant was targeted by Obama's executive orders, which were carried out by the EPA. Well, this is familiar to you, I'm sure, many of the things I'm mentioning here. It's worth noting that outside of academia is not the primary place, not the only place certainly, but one of the most important places in which political correctness comes up. The baleful consequences of political correctness have also been noted by intelligence specialists. Another quote from a former intelligence analyst named Stella Morabito, who herself is the product of a left-wing family, she says this, writing in The Federalist. She details how the left uses mass manipulation techniques to confuse Americans and grab power. She condemns conservatives for not even realizing the behavior modification techniques being employed in the public square, such as those encouraged by liberals such as Cass Sunstein, who wrote the book Nudge, or George Lakoff. It was a project of cultural Marxists to capture the mediating institutions of our culture for ideological gain: the media, Hollywood, pop culture, academia, and war. If you push an agenda to centralize power, you need mass ignorance and effective propaganda. Morabito says political correctness provides, quote, a semantic fog where manipulation can occur under the guise of being fair or non-discriminatory. She details 3 tactics in the manipulation she observes. These include being subtle enough that people are not aware of the manipulation, changing our language to achieve thought control, and the leverage of social isolation being used to force conformity to the elite's narratives. Okay, we're all aware, I think, in a general way, of the presence, the overweening presence of political correctness in our country today. But of course, it's not limited to our country. Apropos of what's happened recently in Europe, it's even more predominant in Europe. I'll mention some things that are characteristic of various European states. I'm sure many of you are aware of this, some of you may not be. Did you know you cannot be essentially a journalist in Sweden today unless you go to a journalism school to get a license? And all the professors at this school are hard leftists. Sweden, since 1975, has pursued an active policy of encouraging massive diversity of population. Sweden, of course, was one of the main Scandinavian countries. Its population was understandably Swedish until after the Second World War. In 1975, under the control of a leftist government, the liberal social democrats in Sweden, who controlled most of Sweden's politics for the last half-century and more, they instituted this policy of actively seeking to bring non-Swedes into Sweden. And we're not talking about other Europeans, but non-Europeans. So the result is that today, Sweden has, in terms of its actual population, it has the highest percentage of Muslim migrants of any country in Europe, which means it probably has the largest percentage of any country in the world outside of the Muslim area themselves. We're aware, probably, you've heard some information about incidents of violence, rape by Muslim migrants, particularly those that come in the last year into Sweden. Were you aware that the primary news organs in Sweden actively prevent mention of these rapes in the news media? The police themselves, who are essentially agents of a hard socialist government, they're not communists, but they're extremely socialist. The police themselves have said that they are reluctant to give notice of rapes because they don't want to encourage their opposition. That is the political party in Sweden known as the Democrat, the Swedish Democrats. That's as close as you get to a Republican Party in Sweden. Sweden today, and the same can be said about certain other European countries, is approaching the point where native Swedes, people of Swedish descent, are almost at the point of wondering whether they're losing their sovereignty because of this active effort on the part of the government to prevent acknowledging problems and actively, essentially, thereby to encourage them. An incident from Norway, another Scandinavian country. We tend to have a good attitude toward Norway. We don't think of it as being offensive nation by any means. It was a victim of the Nazis in the Second World War. But today's Norway is, again, another extreme leftist regime in which all behavior is essentially determined, all official state behavior in the various organs of the state is determined by political correctness. An illustration of how this can lead, where this can lead. The end of last year, 2015, a Swedish, a Norwegian fundamentalist family, I think they were, I forgot what church, but they were a fundamentalist Christian church, had their 5 children taken from them by the Norwegian state welfare agency. And the charge that compelled the Swedish welfare agency to take the children from them was that they were indoctrinating their children in Christian propaganda, essentially.
Oh,
This year, just in January, in this same country of Norway, in the city of Stavanger, there was a welfare center, a Muslim, mainly Muslim welfare center for recent migrants, in which a 3-year-old boy was raped by a number of Muslim migrants. When there were protests raised against this, the woman in charge of the welfare center, state officials, said, well, all cultures have different moral values, essentially. And what is offensive to us is not necessarily offensive to other cultures. And this is the price we pay for a free society. Now, you talk about warped thinking. That goes as far as I think it can go. What we're witnessing in Belgium, the most recent events in Belgium, again, another highly politically correct culture. Did you know that Belgian police are supposed to be investigating or looking for sources of terrorists among them in such cities as Molenbeek, which is near Brussels itself? Until recently, this may have changed now, but until recently, the police were forbidden to stage raids after 9 o'clock in the evening. It's amazing. When in the wake of the recent bombings, a teacher at a secondary school in, I think it was Molenbeek or somewhere near there, tweeted that large numbers of his students who were Muslim were cheering these bombings. He was visited within hours by 3 policemen who said he had to stop sending out such messages. So we're talking here about cultures. What is true, I could give you many more anecdotes from other countries in Europe. But we're talking about cultures which have essentially ceased defending themselves, or on the point of ceasing to defend themselves. People who do seek to defend themselves in these cultures find themselves ostracized. They are the ones who are visited by the organs of government, by the police, not the perpetrators of the violence. This is a degree of self-censorship and denial of self-sovereignty that we haven't witnessed before. Now, we're not at this point, but we are in a line to achieving this point. We're a culture which has allowed, essentially, the minority opinions, although these are the opinions emanating from the major sources of authority in these points. I mean, the media, Hollywood, celebrities, and activists in academia, the sorts that I was referring to there in those quotes. We've allowed these people to color our perception of reality. When we hear a figure like Donald Trump denounced for plain speaking, essentially, I expect, I'm sure you agree with me, that the reason why he has appealed to so many people is because he's not governed by these attitudes, by these strictures. He's willing to call a spade a spade. He's willing to denounce political correctness. And we are simply not, we haven't been used to hearing this from our leaders. We should be. It's perfectly expectable that we should be, but we haven't been. With respect to academia, I could give you a few examples of things I experienced. As I said, they were not nearly as bad when I was an active teacher as they are now. I taught primarily introductory philosophy and critical thinking, which is sort of a poor man's logic, if you will.
It's also a very loaded political term these days.
What?
It's a very loaded political term these days.
That's true.
They usually mean the opposite.
That's right. Many people, and
Uncritical
indeed I found
thinking.
this to be the case among fellow faculty. There was a great ignorance, particularly among people in the so-called humanities, about what critical thinking actually was. And in fact, we had to, at some point, we had to teach, at one point we had to teach our fellow faculty members elements of critical thinking. And I began by saying, well, you know, critical thinking dispenses with emotion. It excludes emotion. This is not a fact of logic. And there were shouts of horror at this, because the impression they had was that it's entirely emotion. You know, you win arguments by being emotional. That's what they thought. But when I was throughout most of my teaching career, we still had at the primary institution I taught at, we still had requirements, core requirements. Students had to take, for example, one course in introductory philosophy, which was for me Introduction to Western Philosophy, historical introduction, and one course in logic or critical thinking. These were requirements. I think they're good requirements for all students who got a BA. Now, toward the end of my career, and this indeed explains why it was the end of my career, the faculty, in a rather stupid decision, decided to alter those requirements, essentially drop them and replace them with another scheme whereby courses such as what they called critical thinking would be taught by all faculty, or most of the faculty, in the humanities department. This was stupid, but it had the effect of eliminating the core requirements, and it also eliminated my job in the process, because most of the courses that I taught were indeed in those core areas. You don't find many students who will major in philosophy. Philosophy is a relatively rare subject. And I mean, in terms of getting money from it, there aren't that many professors of philosophy. But of course, it's a good background for many other areas. But the effect of this, as I said, was to flatten the program. Yes?
One of the stories that's written from the headlines is over at Emory University, where students are being coddled.
Yes.
I'm trying to come up with the right words. I am limited. Because somebody wrote on the steps, Trump 2016, you know, get used to it.
Right.
And they're terrified. This is some sort of hate crime similar to scratching swastikas onto Jewish temples or something equally evil. And of course, it was done in chalk, and we don't know who did it or how they did it. And frankly, it's a political season. Somebody could put such a bumper sticker anywhere. I can't connect people who cannot handle that with, you know, what I find in my email box every morning being sent to me because I'm a public member of the Worcester Tea Party. How can people who cannot be able to indulge in the give and take of ideas and that need to be shielded from such delicate prodding be able to feel that they will be able to hold on to anything, a job,
So they
career?
They didn't have in the fantasy world. And the fantasy world has been actually maintained, nurtured by the setting in which they find themselves. They went to schools in which certain levels of political correctness were enforced. They graduated from these schools, entered colleges. They found the same thing, except multiple times worse. And the phenomena, for example, of safe zones, panic rooms, triggers, if somebody's going to say something offensive, these are all phenomena that didn't exist when I was teaching. But I did at that point already find students who thought that the purpose of an education was to become essentially politically correct. I did encounter that phenomenon. And if I met with that in a student in my courses, I'd set them straight on that. You know, but I guess probably that's an exception.
Well, that's probably why they eliminated your entire.
Well, it may have played
That was scary.
Right. But
Also, finding is very dangerous to political ideology. Right.
The reference you're making here to Emory University, it's very amusing if you actually look at the pictures. I've seen some pictures of these. They're just chalk words like Trump.
not on a step, but on a series of steps. So you're walking up a stairway and someone you see Trump, Trump, Trump. It's very funny, you know. And what's the problem here? I mean, we're all used to we have all grown up experiencing. Certainly, you cannot be a conservative in Massachusetts and not hear opposing viewpoints. I mean, you can't walk down Cambridge Street without running into a liberal or a leftist, you know. What's the problem? The problem is, sort of ironically, the very people who have been in charge of our instruction, particularly at the academic level, the college level, have been fostering a setting that encourages not willingness to hear another viewpoint, but forbidding other viewpoints, preventing other viewpoints from being spoken, from being spread. And the result is you get these insulated students who are actually, psychologically, it seems, in a state of panic when they hear something that goes outside of the realm of what they've heard. It's absurd. Can it last? Doesn't seem to me it can last. But they've already wreaked a lot of havoc. You know, we produced a culture. I don't want to say a culture entirely of nuisance, but look at us. Most of us are older people here. Among the younger people, I'm not sure if you'll find the same willingness and readiness to hear other ideas that I heard when I was in my 20s or 30s. Also, you don't find another factor here that may seem not completely relevant, but I think it is. When I was young, there was a military draft in existence. Young men had to perform military service. It so happened that in my family, I had 3 brothers. We had all volunteered. So when my turn came, I volunteered. So it was a normal thing for us to get military service, which incidentally had two collateral benefits. It gave me some money to support myself when I was a student later on, and it also gave me more maturity, so that when I got into college, I knew what I wanted to do. Young men in particular in today's colleges need something like that. I mention young men because they tend to be more lost in college. They don't know why they're there in many cases. They simply do not know why. What are they doing? And of course, we know when you're at that age, there are all kinds of manifold opportunities for fun on a college campus. And that's what they indulge in, a big percentage. Right? My own attitude was that probably close to half the students in colleges I taught at shouldn't be in college. They should be going to some sort of vocational training, where they probably would wind up making more living than they would with a college degree. There's many more things I can address, but maybe if you have any other questions, I can deal with those, or I can pass. Yes, yeah.
Well, John, like you, although more from the outside, I've been observing this stuff for a very long time. I went to an extremely liberal school. Although I think in the period that I went there, politics was considered square.
This is harder.
Hard. But I mean, it was a very left-wing liberal arts school. But in that era, the politics was considered passé, so it was less oppressive for that reason. But in the period that I was going, the first conservative backlash, which was the efflorescence of conservative journals all over, some of them were funded by a Washington Foundation, but a lot of them started up on their own. When you and I were running the Conservative Society, there were always these little student papers, right? PC, U,
right,
and Harvard. This is such an old battle, and there's some pushback. There'll be some pushback by what happened last year, okay? And then there's a pause, and then it goes on again.
right.
It's time to blow it up.
Well, that's opportune that you should mention that. Probably this election is going to see some aspects of it blown up. The fact that we have a leader contender who makes no bones about his contempt for political correctness, I think is inspiring other people who kept their mouths shut and cooperated with it to speak up. The columns that Donald Trump is addressing and speaking to at the national level are adumbrated throughout our culture. In the level of people, academics, we've been
Serious
schools in general.
I don't see Donald Trump doing anything past short term. It's going to be a serious project to deconstruct the academy.
I don't think you're going to get the word or concept deconstruct out of Donald Trump somehow.
No. Dismantle. But I mean, state legislatures can blow if they really want to. They've never had the nerve But maybe this year, some states like Missouri, they'll just say, we're not paying for any more quote-unquote studies departments. But generally speaking, we have to make the university, college, I mean, this is a long march to the institutions.
Sure.
There is no solution for next year or the year after. And trying to reform the institutions is what we've been doing for the last 50 years.
Right.
Trying to get an independent voice, trying to, you know, there are all these organizations for FIRE and National Association of Scholars. They've been on for a long time.
And they've done nothing.
Well,
They're almost
they've
like
done
the
something, but
Republicans who were elected at
it's a holy action.
Right.
And
One thing, though, I think we can expect, and I've been advising this whenever I get in context, like when I've spoken to the Rotary Club and other groups, we can expect people now to do. Parents of college-age young people, I tell them how bad the situation is, and their response to me typically is this: well, what you say may be true of certain colleges, but it's not true of the college where my Tiffany goes to college. In other words, they make the same assumption that people do about Congress. They say, well, there may be bad congressmen, but my congressman isn't a bad congressman.
Right.
Now that's changed. That's changed.
But the thing is
So what
Ed,
I'm
let's
saying
get
is
Mike
that
in here.
people who are parents of college-age young people have to tell the colleges, okay, you have to stop hiring and bringing in more of these leftists. You have to stop creating
they have to
left-wing
stop going to the
departments.
colleges and
You have to stop,
be-
and stop funding. You know, just respond to their requests for funding. No, I'm not going to fund. You had a question, sir?
Well, I had a comment. Back in the late 1920s and early 30s, a gentleman named Hitler had a group, the SA, brown shirts. And their role was to go in and beat the crap out of opposition speakers in opposition political rallies. That role has changed. Today, it's done by school teachers and school administrators in our country. We pay for school teachers to brutalize a kid, second grade, who kisses a girl or a boy, you know, on the cheek.
Right.
He's committed a sex crime, and that kid is. Our school teachers have become the stormtroopers, the thugs. And whether it's in second grade or whether it's in college, you know, we have to recognize that we have to replace our school boards at the local level. We have to fire teachers, fire administrators, and be ruthless about it.
Or respect.
I agree.
The battle is lost. The public schools are lost. Academia is lost. What needs to be done is to abandon them and start fresh.
Well, with response to what happened in
This has been going
Brussels,
on for 50 years.
what happened in Brussels, you had Mr. Obama go to a ball game with a dictator, and then go and tango in Buenos Aires, sending the message that you are expected to accept Muslim terrorism as
Yes.
business as usual.
Now, thank you.
You are.
Thank you.